Well, greetings and welcome to episode 138 of Bible 180, 180 episodes between Genesis and Revelation. Today we're on two stories in John chapter 6, the feeding of the 5,000, John's version of it, and then Jesus walking on the water, which immediately follows the feeding of the 5,000. Let me read John's version of the feeding of the 5,000. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we going to get bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he already knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in that place, and so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they said, "This is indeed the same prophet who has come into the world." So that is John's version of the feeding of the 5,000. A little bit different, and what I'd like to do is walk our way through John chapter 6 and see how this feeding of the 5,000 sets the stage for Jesus walking on the water. The story begins with Jesus going to the other side of the sea, and the large crowd kept following, importantly, because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. They were following him not because they believed in him, but because they wanted to know, not because they wanted to know him as Lord and Savior, but because of the miracles that he was doing, healing the sick. They followed him because of the signs and wonders. When Jesus saw that, he went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. He sat down because that's a teaching position. Normally teachers stand up in our day, but they sat down in Jesus' day. He went up the mountain because mountains represented places where spectacular things would happen. Mount of Transfiguration, Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb, Mount Moriah, places where things amazing broke into history. Verse 4, now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. Interesting to know, especially in John, that many things that Jesus did happened during the time of the festival. Festival of the Passover was when they remembered how God brought them out of captivity in Egypt, and they crossed the Red Sea on their way to the Promised Land. When Jesus looked up and saw a crowd, he said to Philip, "Where are we going to buy bread for all these people to eat?" He said this to test him. Jesus knew he was about to do something because Jesus knows a whole lot of things. He said this to Philip to find out how he might respond, and Philip failed miserably. Philip said, 6 months' wages would not have enough bread for each of them to get a little. Philip was saying, "We don't have enough money. We don't have enough money." Right then Andrew came, and the story continues. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. And Jesus' heart must have leapt for joy. Yes, there's a boy with 5 loaves, and now we have 2 fish. That's awesome. Just what we need. Andrew continues, but, remember the word but negates what went before, but what are 2 fish going to do for so many people? Philip said, "We don't have enough money." Andrew said, "We don't have enough resources." Sounds like several church councils I've dealt with in the past. Not, all the time, but we don't have enough money. We don't have the resources. So we can't do what God is calling us to do. So Philip looked at the crowds and not Jesus. That was his problems. Andrew looked at the little boy and not Jesus. And that was his problem. When they both should have done was look at what was right in front of them and offer to God what they had, and then just sit back and watch what Jesus would do with them, to wait until the miracle happens. Too many people, the needs are too great. They didn't have enough money. They didn't have the resources to do anything. The problems before them were too great. And Jesus, how could you be expected to do anything when, how could you accomplish when what we have is so little? The question is this morning, as you listen to this episode, what have you decided in your life is too big for God to accomplish? What kinds of problems or challenges do you have that are too big for God to handle? What lack of money or resources or gifts or ability do you have that you make it impossible to think that God might do something with little old you? What is in yourself that is too little for God to work with? What concerns have you developed over the last years that you wonder whether even God cares about? What worries do you hold on to because you are reluctant to turn them over to God? The lesson from this John's telling of the feeding of the 5,000 is you have to start with what you got. Remember what you got. Ain't much. Great, Jesus says. Turn what little you have over to me and then watch what I'll do with it. 5 loaves and 2 fishes ain't much. How much you got? I ain't got much. 5 loaves and 2 fishes. Start with what you have and offer it to God. Watch what God can do and then wait for the miracle to happen. That's what Jesus did with the bread and the fish from the little boy. Notice that the little boy is not named, but what a great kid. We don't know anything about him. In fact, we know more about the little drummer boy than we know about this boy, but that's often how God works, with nameless people, unknown actors, and God's great power. When we trust God with what we have, God takes that little amount and makes it incredible. So Jesus takes the loaves and fish, and he gave thanks. He distributed to those who were seated, and also the fish as much as they want. Jesus gave thanks, communion language like he would in a short time at the Last Supper. And there were 12 baskets left over, 12 baskets representing the 12 tribes of Israel, an object lesson that each of the disciples could relate to. So that's the first story, okay, the feeding of the 5,000. Immediately following that, verse 16, when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough, and a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near them, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, ego eimi, it is I, do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat. Listen to this. They wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they are going. So Jesus doesn't even get in to the boat. It was a dark and stormy night, right? After the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus withdrew by the mountain to pray. Evening came, it was dark, it was night, the sun had gone down, the sky was completely black, and the disciples pushed off from shore and started across the Sea of Galilee. They didn't know how bad the storm would become, and dark, billowing clouds were starting to cover the sky. They could hear the howling wind and feel the waves beating up against the boat. They rowed maybe 3-4 miles across the deep lake with the waves lifting their boat high in the air, dropping it down with a great splash of water. They were in danger and they were panicking. It was a dark and stormy night. But notice what happens. They look out and see Jesus walking on a turbulent sea. John writes that they were terrified, scared to death, helplessly and hopelessly being tossed and turned with the waves, crying out for help. But then they saw Jesus walking on the water, and they were terrified even more. But then Jesus spoke to them, "It is I, ego eimi," the Greek words which means I am, ego eimi. The disciples on the boat on that stormy night would have recognized those words, ego eimi, I am, with the words that God identified himself with Exodus 3, with Moses out of the burning bush. Moses says, "Who shall I say is sending me?" God says, "I am." Ego eimi is what God says. Almighty Creator God, who is bigger and stronger than any circumstances and obstacles we face in life, who is stronger than any storm we will face. God was with them on the stormy seas in Jesus. They were terrified. Jesus says, ego eimi, I am he. I am present with you in the storm. The fact that Jesus is walking across those stormy and billowing seas means he's bigger and stronger than the storm, bigger and stronger than any of our storms. And notice what happens in verse 21. They wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land to which they were going. Fascinating the way that Luke tells his account of the stormy seas. What did Jesus not do? In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he didn't pull Peter out of the water. Note that Jesus did not calm the sea and the waves. Rather, they wanted to take him into the boat, but immediately they reached the land to which they were going. Okay? Jesus doesn't get into the boat. He doesn't calm the sea and the waves. He's with them, and then they reach the other side. Interesting. On that dark and stormy night, did the storm immediately end when Jesus came to them? No. Did the waves and winds stop pounding? Did the wind stop blowing? Did the sea get all calm and nice? No. They were still in the storm, but Jesus saw them safely through the storm to the other side. The Gospel of John does not say that Jesus calmed the sea and the waves. The miracle is that Jesus stayed with them through the storm to the other side and to safety. So when you think about that first story, feeding of the 5,000s, what is it in life that's too big for you to handle over to God? What do you have that's too little or insignificant to offer to God? What are you holding back from God because you don't think it's enough? The second story, storm at the sea. Does it do your heart good to know that Jesus is with you? That Jesus says, I am. Jesus represents the God of the Bible. That Jesus is with you and will be with you through any storm you're facing. Jesus doesn't calm the sea and the waves in the Gospel of John, but he's with them to the other side. Are we in storms in our lives? Yes, sometimes we are, but the miracle is the great I am, the great God himself. Jesus, who loves us, is with us. And when we cry out for help, when we reach out, when we trust him, when we look to him, he will be with us through whatever it is that life deals us. So make it a great day. Be grateful. And I look forward to being with you in the next episode. Bye-bye.